Hey everyone, Governor Bill Lee here. My fellow Tennesseans, today marks a significant day in our state's history. It was on February 6, 1796, that William Blount and 54 other founding citizens gathered in Knoxville to sign the document that gave birth to Tennessee. That moment began a process that culminated 4 months later when Congress admitted Tennessee to the Union as our nation's 16th state on June 1st of that year. We can take great pride in all Tennessee has become and all our citizens have accomplished in the 225 years since these historic events took place. Much has changed, but the important things remain the same. The people of the volunteer state remain bold innovators and risk takers and visionaries, reflecting the same courage and strength of character that led William Blount and our founders to put their fortunes and reputations on the line to create a new state west of the mountains. Thank you, Governor Blount, and happy 225th birthday, Tennessee.
Thank you, Governor Lee, and happy birthday, Tennessee. I'm Michael Jordan, the Director of Marketing and Development here at Blount Mansion National Historic Landmark, the birthplace of Tennessee. In our special video presentation today, we're going to take a look at this important milestone in Tennessee history. It was on this day, February 6th in 1796, when, as Governor Lee mentioned, William Blount and 54 other founders of our state gathered to put quill pen to paper and create the state of Tennessee. Tennessee took a winding path to statehood. After the American Revolution, the current footprint of Tennessee, all the way from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River, was part of North Carolina. It was difficult for the authorities on the other side of the mountains to govern this vast frontier area. The over-mountain settlers were frustrated and wanted to run their own affairs. In August of 1784, a group led by John Sevier banded together, declared their independence from North Carolina, and named themselves the state of Franklin. North Carolina pushed back. Congress refused to recognize the would-be state, and the independence movement fell apart. The stage was set for change in 1789 when North Carolina gave control of its western lands to the federal government, paving the way for the creation of the Southwest Territory. The next year, President George Washington appointed 41-year-old North Carolinian William Blount, a signer of the U.S. Constitution, to govern the new territory. After negotiating peace with warring Native American tribes, building his mansion, and founding the city of Knoxville as a territorial capital, Blount set in motion a series of events that ended in statehood for the territory. A census indicated that a majority of the territory's residents favored statehood and local control over remaining a federal territory. Blount called for a constitutional convention, which began meeting in January 1796 in David Henley's office, at the present-day site of this parking lot at Gay and Church Streets in downtown Knoxville. While the building was demolished before the Civil War, Henley's tall standing desk, on which the resulting state constitution was signed, survived and is proudly exhibited in Governor Blount's office at Blount Mansion. Because of the leading role Territorial Governor William Blount took in guiding Tennessee into statehood, Blount Mansion National Historic Landmark is known as the birthplace of Tennessee. As part of our virtual commemoration today, we'll be learning more about what's in Tennessee's founding document and the unusual method that Tennessee used to gain statehood. We'll also learn about the beautiful desk that Constitution was signed on. We have it here at Blount Mansion, and we'll be talking about the things that Blount Mansion is doing to preserve this important piece of Tennessee furniture for future generations. But let's begin with a conversation I had with Jack Neely, one of Knoxville's foremost journalists and historians, about the men who gathered here in Knoxville in the winter of 1796 to give birth to a new state. We're here in the East Wing of Blount Mansion now with Jack Neely, who is a local historian, author of numerous books, part of the Knoxville History Project, and kind of the go-to guy if you want to know more about who were the people and the quirky stories they're associated with that surround and inform the founding of Tennessee. So as we look at the birth of Tennessee, what is the significance of February 6th, 1796?
February 6, 1796 was once on the state seal. Everybody saw it every day in Tennessee for about 30-something years. This was considered the birth date of Tennessee because this was the day that here in Knoxville, 55 members of this delegation that met here as the Constitutional Convention signed the very first state constitution. And that was the date after 3 weeks of arguing and compromising and so forth. They came up with a constitution they could all agree with, and this was this was a momentous day in the state's history that I think we've kind of forgotten in some ways. This was Tennessee was unusual in that statehood began as a grassroots thing. It was a bunch of guys got together, said, "This looks like a state. Let's call it a state. Let's have a constitution," and send it to Congress and dare them to say no. And that's kind of what they did. We celebrate today, Statehood Day, as June 1st, because that was the day that Congress up in Philadelphia agreed that yes, you are a state and you've done all the proper paperwork. This is a state with 60,000 people or something like that. That's the state that we came to be known as. That was the day that came to be known as official Statehood Day, June 1st, the Congressional Day. But for many years, getting together in Knoxville was considered the beginning of the state several months earlier, because by February 6th and by March, actually, the following month, we had a state legislature meeting here. We had elected senators and sent them to Philadelphia. Philadelphia didn't admit them yet, but we had elected them and sent them there and said, "Hey, we're a state, we're knocking on the door, let us in." And they finally did. But the local story, the Tennessee story, was here in Knoxville. These 3 weeks that these guys came here and met in a big room believed to be on Gay Street, the David Henley office, the only room in town that was big enough to hold 55 guys and their aides, and talk about this and sign the Constitution, which was believed to be drafted here at Blount Mansion. But it was the people who got here together here in January and February of 1796. If they had gotten here just for a barbecue, it would have been a historic moment, because never before or since then have so many major early leaders of Tennessee been in one place for one purpose. And this was it's amazing to picture all these guys together. I mean, we began with the president of the Constitution, who was William Blount, who was the governor, the territorial governor of the Southwestern Territory. How many state constitutional conventions have a guy who signed the U.S. Constitution as the president of the convention? This was a big deal just for him to be there, because he was the local host, more or less, and the president of the convention. But also we have not only major figures in Tennessee history, but a lot of major figures in national history. A lot of people scan the list of signers, and it's easy to find on the internet if you want to look at it. But you say, gosh, that's Andrew Jackson in 1796. He wasn't even famous then. He was a local young attorney. He was 28 years old. He was here. They say he had a red ponytail at that time. But he was here and mainly just kind of an outspoken young attorney. And this is a long time before his heroism at New Orleans and everything else, and 30-something years before he became president. But
kind of a protege of William Blount too.
He was, yeah. He and Blount were close in those days. But Andrew Jackson was here. According to an old story that's hard to prove or disprove, it was at Jackson that suggested the name of Tennessee, based on an old Cherokee word. There's no evidence to this, but people have just been saying that for generations. But another major figure who was here, and is kind of surprising to see, was probably the youngest member of the convention. And he was even younger than Jackson. He was perhaps as young as 21. His name was William Charles Cole Claiborne. He wasn't famous then. He was a very young attorney, but he would later go on to was briefly governor of the territory of Mississippi, but later was the territorial governor of the Orleans Territory after the purchase of the Louisiana Purchase, and then became the first English-speaking governor of Louisiana after that. And that's why he's a major figure in New Orleans history. If you go to New Orleans, the longest street in the whole city is called Claiborne Avenue, and it's named for this guy who was here in Knoxville signing the Tennessee Constitution in 1796. Also, our Claiborne County is named for him.
Example of how the birth of Tennessee results in the eventual birth of lots of other states too.
Yeah, exactly. And we have to remember that these weren't. It's one thing you notice is these weren't necessarily Southerners, and when you think about it, in 1796 they didn't really have the same concept of Southerners, because half the South wasn't even part of the English-speaking United States at the time. You know, it was this before we had the states of Alabama and Mississippi, and Louisiana was still part of Spain in 1796, and so was Arkansas and Texas. These were not even, you know, half of the states that were later part of the Confederacy.
This was the
65 years
West.
later.
This was the Wild West.
Yeah, it was, and everybody here was from the East, more or less. I think almost everybody who came here, if they didn't come directly from Ireland, and we had 2 Irish immigrants who were here signing the Tennessee Constitution, at least 2.
Who were they?
They were from here in Knox County. John Adair was one of the representatives from Knox County, and we have, of course, Adair Park and so forth in Fountain City in his honor. That's where he lived. He had a long commute every day. He was in Knoxville every day, but rode back and forth. And the other was John Ray, who was also born in Ireland, had lived in Philadelphia before he came here. But Ray County is named for him. So we have a Tennessee county named for an Irish refugee, basically. But these were people from, a lot of the people who were gathered here in Knoxville were not, some of them were from North Carolina, some of them were from Virginia, as we might expect, the established, the former colonies that were right next door. But a lot of them were from Pennsylvania. A lot of the people who came here and signed the Constitution, at least half a dozen of them were people who had lived in Philadelphia.
Come down through the Cumberland.
That's right, yeah. But including Knoxville's own Charles McClung, who was James White's son-in-law, who was one of the, I think can be considered one of the founders of Knoxville, was originally from the Philadelphia area. But quite a John McNary, Archibald Roane. Archibald Roane is an interesting guy because he had been in the Continental Army and had been, according to one source, was one of the soldiers who was with Washington when they crossed the Delaware.
Oh, wow.
During the Revolutionary War. A lot of these guys, in fact, I would bet that maybe more than half of them were Revolutionary War veterans who signed this Constitution. But these were 55 people we had only 11 counties in the territory, the Southwestern Territory, and each of the 11 counties sent their five guys to come here to Knoxville to found a state. And they were, in most cases, the cream of the crop. These were guys who were really well known, and a lot of these, I think about a dozen of the signers of the Constitution who were here in January and February of 1796 were people who later had counties named for them. Like Joseph Anderson was one. He was another one of the guys from Philadelphia, but Anderson County is named for him. William Cock is another interesting guy who was here. He had been a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses at the same time that Thomas Jefferson was. So they knew each other. If we think about these people, they all knew a lot of the founding fathers of America. Of course, William Blount knew Washington and Jefferson and them very well. But these were people who, a lot of these people who had lived in Philadelphia knew, Franklin and Washington and Jefferson, and these people who had been, founding a whole nation up there. They were also down here and taking cues from that, I think, to found a state, not only 9 years after the nation was founded. The founders of Knoxville were all there, William Blount and James White and Charles McClung. And these are the 3 guys that basically cobbled together this city, and they were all there and all signed the Constitution. And by the way, just down the street is the First Presbyterian graveyard where William Blount is buried and also James White, 2 of the signers of the Constitution, but also the chaplain. The Constitution had a chaplain, and his name was Samuel Carrick. He was also from Eastern Pennsylvania. And he was a guy that read a non-denominational prayer at the very beginning of the Constitution. But he's also buried there. So we have remnants. We have relics of this here and there. Oh, one other guy I have not mentioned, whose name you notice, is James Robertson. And this was a guy who's very well known in Nashville. He's considered the founder of Nashville, and I think he's been called the father of Middle Tennessee. So these were the honchos of early Tennessee meeting together in one place, and these were a lot of these. They were frontiersmen. They were And some of them were literally explorers. I think James Robertson and some of the others had actually traveled with Daniel Boone, knew these major these legends of American history. And as explorers, they didn't necessarily like to be around a lot of people. They liked the wide open spaces and making their own way. And it is remarkable that they all came together. They were probably uncomfortable about it, but 55 strong-willed, independent-minded guys who were used to the wide open spaces, crowding together in one room and getting this thing done, and call themselves a state so they wouldn't have to be under the thumb of the presidential administration, whoever it was, and they're making their own laws, their own rules after this. But just a remarkable bunch of people to create something that Jefferson called the least imperfect and most Republican of all the state constitutions. He was impressed with this piece of work that we got done here in Knoxville in 1796.
Well, Jack Neely from the Knoxville History Project and author of many books, a journalist, thank you so much for your time and for helping us to kind of peel back the layer and see what's the interesting stories behind our first state constitution.
Yeah, and thanks for all you do in this great place. This is literally the only building that in Knoxville that lasts that's still here from the 1796, the beginning of statehood, the statehood period, Blount Mansion.
We hope to be here another 225 years, but only time will tell. As Jack mentioned, when Tennessee gained admission to the Union, we did it in a way that no other state had done it before, and it's come to be known as the Tennessee Method. I spoke about this with constitutional law scholar Stewart Harris, who also explored just what's in Tennessee's 1796 Constitution. Our conversation took place right here in Blount Mansion. Stewart Harris is a professor of constitutional law at Lincoln Memorial University and also here a board member at Blount Mansion, which is the only home of a U.S. Constitution signer that's not in one of the original 13 colonies. But more importantly, for our purposes today, it's the home of the man who shepherded Tennessee into statehood. Yeah. So let's start out by talking about the Tennessee Method. What is the Tennessee Method and what made it an unusual way to become a state?
Well, the easiest way to describe the Tennessee Method is the guy who simply bellies up to the bar and demands to be served. That's what Tennessee did. Or perhaps it's more reminiscent of the old expression, it's easier to get forgiveness than it is to get permission. Tennessee was the very first state that was a territory before it became a state. And there were methods that were prescribed for that, and they basically required congressional approval. And it was going to take too long. Tennessee was not willing to wait. And so when the Congress failed to act upon their petition for statehood, they said, well, what the heck, we're just going to do it ourselves. So they adopted a constitution, they elected state and federal officials, and then they sent those federal officials, including William Blount, and William Koch, our first two senators, to the Senate of the United States. And they, quite literally, were knocking on the door of the Senate chamber demanding to be let in. And it took a while, but fairly soon thereafter, the Senate said, oh, okay, we'll do it. And we did it. And so within months after beginning the process, Tennessee became a state on June the 1st, I believe, of 1796.
And there were national politics that played into this, right? There were bigger reasons why Congress drug their feet about admitting Tennessee to the Union, and reasons why some members of Congress were anxious to get Tennessee in.
There are always political reasons, and they're very fundamental political reasons, because think about it, in our federal system of government, the states have power. Each state has 2 senators, and each state has some representatives, depending on the state's population. And this not only affects the Congress, but it affects the Electoral College, which ultimately affects the presidency. And so every time there's a debate over the admission of a new state, whether it's in 1796 or whether it's 2021, politics is involved. In this particular case, the 2 parties were the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, or simply Republicans as they were then called, although it's a different party from the later Republican Party. Jefferson was the head of the Democratic Republicans, and he was very much in favor of Tennessee because he thought Tennessee would help in the upcoming presidential election. And Alexander Hamilton and his Federalists were opposed to Tennessee for the very same reason. Now, eventually they struck a compromise with William Blount and William Koch out there knocking on the door, the Congress agreed as follows. Okay, we'll let Tennessee in, but only with one representative for now. And by the way, you all have to go back to Tennessee, hold your elections again, now that we've let you in as a state, make everything legitimate, and take a census. And only then will we allow you some more representatives according to your population. And Tennessee accepted this, but that guaranteed that Tennessee would not have as much power in the Electoral College in the next presidential election as it might otherwise have had. And so that's why the Federalists allowed it to happen.
So in other words, it's kind of a catch-22. You can't become a state until you have a government to represent you and congressmen and senators, but you can't elect those people until you're a state.
Right.
So it's circular, and Tennessee got around it by compromising.
Tennessee got around it by demanding it. That's basically what it is. That's the Tennessee method. It's just demanding to be a state. And Tennessee satisfied all the requirements. It had enough population. It had formed its own constitution, its own government. These were American citizens, and all they really were asking for was their full rights as citizens of the United States by becoming citizens of a state.
What did Thomas Jefferson say about our first state constitution?
It was something about being the most perfect Republican constitution there is. I forget the exact statement, but he used the word Republican in it, and that was by design. It was because he was the head of the Democratic Republican Party. And so that was a great compliment by him. But of course, scholars have not explained to us why he said these laudatory things about the Tennessee Constitution. I think there are many reasonable theories. My personal favorite is that we went very far, Tennessee's first constitution went very far toward protecting religious freedom. Not only was there a ban on religious tests, not only was there guarantees of free exercise of religion and no establishment of religion in the state, but one very funny, perhaps even unique clause in the Tennessee Constitution says that basically no preachers can be elected.
Makes you wonder who they had in mind, you know?
It's very, very interesting, and they couch it in terms that are very, very positive. You know, it's the job of ministers to, you know, serve the eternal God and higher things than mere politics. So, you know, to help them out, we're not going to let them serve in the government. Well, okay, but that's an interesting disqualification, isn't it?
What else is in that first state constitution?
Oh, lots of stuff. One of the things that's, again, unusual about it is that every free man of property could vote. That meant white men and black men. Now, think about this. Slavery definitely existed at this time. Slaves were all throughout Tennessee, and there's even one reference in the Tennessee Constitution, the original Constitution, about taxing slaves in a certain fashion. So it's acknowledged in the Tennessee Constitution that slavery exists, and yet, as long as a slave has been freed, then he can vote. I say the word he advisedly because, of course, it was only men then. Sorry, ladies, it took you a long time. That's very interesting because that was the law in Tennessee for decades until a later Tennessee Constitution, I think it was 1834 or thereabouts, in the 1830s, removed that ability and, of course, put slavery much more front and center in the Constitution in the lead up to the Civil War.
Do we know why that happened? Was it an oversight? Was it intentional?
I don't think we know why it happened. At least I don't know why it happened. Maybe there are some historical records out there that I've not looked at. But to me, it seems to be one of those afterthoughts. I mean, nobody expected black men to vote in large numbers. And maybe they just assumed that black men wouldn't vote. Maybe they just assumed that all black men in the state were slaves, which was probably very nearly true. I don't know how many free black people there were in Tennessee, but I don't think there were that many. And so they probably just didn't think it through. And I wouldn't be surprised, although I don't know, if many free black men did not exercise their right to vote, because socially and politically it would have been inadvisable for them to do so, even if the Constitution permitted it.
Now, the rest of the Constitution, does it stand out in any way from other state constitutions of the time?
Well, there was a great emphasis on individual rights. We've already talked about religion, but most of the other protections of the U.S. Constitution's Bill of Rights appear in the Tennessee Constitution's Bill of Rights. And also there's one, this time I think it may very well be a unique provision, and that is that every person, every citizen of the state of Tennessee has the right to free navigation on the Mississippi River. Now think about that. Why would they put that in a constitution? Well, because it was very important. Tennessee is bounded by mountains in the east, which made it difficult at that time to trade with, to send goods to market in North Carolina or any of the other eastern states. And so many Tennesseans actually looked west, and they wanted to float their goods down the Tennessee River to the Ohio and thence down the Mississippi, and that's how they were going to get their goods to market. Or if they were lucky enough to live near Memphis, right on the Mississippi River, then they would have direct access to it. But lots of people are going to be landlocked and in Tennessee. And so they wanted to guarantee that no matter where you live in Tennessee, you could sell your goods on the Mississippi River. You could use the Mississippi River to travel. And that might be unique to the state of Tennessee.
Well, they had a special interest in maintaining that, and that navigation too, because that was the western end of the United States, right?
It was.
So this was, we had an international boundary.
Well, politics plays into all of this again. At this time, the Spanish controlled New Orleans and therefore the Mississippi River. That's the background to this, is that people felt that they wanted access to this river. They wanted good relationship with the Spaniards to make sure that they had that access, but they wanted to shore it up here in their Constitution to make sure, at least on this end, it was guaranteed.
Do you think that there's anything noteworthy about what these men did that day? I mean, I guess it was a great deal of bravado involved in just assuming you can create your own state. But other than that, is there anything outstanding about how they brought this together, anything unusual that makes it different than other state constitutions or the processes that created them?
I actually see more commonalities than differences, Michael. What really struck me, well, there were lots of things. For one thing, there was the sheer coincidence that it was 55 delegates here in the state of Tennessee, and there were also 55 delegates to the U.S. Constitutional Convention. Now, I think that's just a coincidence. But many of the other provisions in Tennessee's Constitution and many of the processes by which it came to exist, people coming together, drafting a constitution, debating it, voting on it, that was happening all over the country then. In fact, this was an era of constitutionalism, of constitutional creation. So I would say that Tennessee is more alike the other states than it is different from them.
And we should point out, too, that Tennessee was a trailblazer. 6 other territories became states with the Tennessee method. Those are Michigan in 1837, Iowa in 1846, California in 1850, Oregon in 1859, Kansas in 1861, and Alaska in 1959. So this is still going on into the mid to late 20th century. We know that New Mexico tried to follow the Tennessee method in the 1850s, but it took decades before they were finally able to be admitted to the Union. So what is it about the Tennessee method that makes it so appealing to these other states?
I think it's relative quickness. I mean, that's, I think, the reason Tennessee wanted to use this new method it was inventing. It did not want to wait for statehood. There were many benefits to statehood, and they wanted those benefits. They wanted them now. In fact, that accounts for the haste of the entire process and for the fact that they sent their delegates up there quickly before Congress was scheduled to adjourn later that year. So that's the major benefit of this. New Mexico, as you pointed out, tried to do this in 1850, but look at the date. I suspect they got caught up in the compromises of that era and the great issue, of course, of slavery and the Western expansion of slavery. But for whatever reason, they were not granted statehood, and they were the exception that proved the rule, because then they had to wait 62 years before Congress actually got around to granting them statehood. So that's the advantage of pounding on the door to the Senate, is that maybe they'll let you in.
And I know that activists in Puerto Rico who favor statehood have talked about doing it in Puerto Rico too, but it's just a matter of whether they want to do it or not. It's not the method itself that's flawed.
Ultimately, Article 4 of the Constitution gives the power to Congress to whether it accepts states or not. The only caveat is that Congress can't carve one state, a new state, out of an existing state without that state's acquiescence. But with that caveat, Congress basically decides yay or nay if you're going to be a state. So really then it becomes a matter of politics. If you think the Tennessee method's going to work, then you're going to try it. If you don't think so, then you're going to try some other softer way of getting statehood. But we've been stuck since 1959. We've been stuck since that point, and that's over 60 years ago now. and it's politics again. Slavery is no longer the major issue, but politics is. And several of the areas that are frequently proposed for statehood tend to be Democratic strongholds. The District of Columbia, for example. Puerto Rico is perceived that way as well. And there's also a movement to carve up the state of California into 3 or more states that would individually be larger both in geography and population than many existing states. If the California legislature agreed to that, and if the people of California wanted to do that, they'd still face the hurdle of Congress doing that, because at least most of those states would probably be Democratic leaning. So again, all the people in Congress who are politicians are counting up senators, and they're counting up representatives, and they're ultimately counting up electoral votes, and that's why we haven't had any new states.
So Tennessee broke the mold.
Tennessee, I would say, created its own mold. Okay, there were only 15 states prior to Tennessee, and none of them had been territories, because territories they came along a little bit later. So you had, just before Tennessee, you had the states of Vermont and Kentucky, who were not officially U.S. territories. They just said, you know, we're part of the nation, we're American citizens, and here's our boundaries, and we want to be states. And they were admitted on that basis. But now you have territorial legislation that's affecting Tennessee. And so we were the very first to come under that umbrella. And that's why the people in here in Tennessee, our founders, thought that it was just going to take too darn long. And they didn't want to let things just roll slowly along.
It must be fun to be a constitutional law professor in a state like Tennessee that created its own method of statehood.
It is always fun to be a constitutional law professor. It's particularly fun to be one when you have the good fortune to live in Knoxville, which has the only house of a signer of the Constitution outside the original 13 states. And I might say that it's an honor to serve on the board here as well, because I have learned a great deal about the Constitution from you and from your colleagues. And so I thank you for that opportunity.
I dare say it's not as much as we've learned from you. But thank you so much for your information today and your insight into the real story behind these events of 225 years ago.
Wow.
Thanks a lot. Stewart Harris is a professor of constitutional law at Lincoln Memorial University and a board member here at Blount Mansion. Blount Mansion remains the only structure still standing in Knoxville that was here when that 1796 Constitution was signed. In fact, right here in Governor Blount's office, we have the original statehood desk that the Constitution was signed on. Back in the summer of 2018, I spoke with Blount Mansion Executive Director David Hearns and furniture restoration expert James Hooper of Knoxville about the work we're doing to preserve this important piece of Tennessee furniture for future generations. All right, we are here at the Blount Mansion National Historic Landmark with our Executive Director Dave Hearns and also furniture conservator James Hooper, who is one of the experts in keeping old things looking like they're supposed to, which is not as easy as it might seem. And as you can see, we have upended one of our most famous artifacts. And Dave, if you want to tell us what it is and why we've done that and kind of what's going on today.
This is the Henley Desk. It was built by Thomas Hope, we believe. And as far as we're aware, this is the desk that the first Tennessee Constitution was signed on in 1796. So it's been laid over on its back so we can see the underside, checking the condition, and checking in on our spiders, apparently.
And what have you gentlemen found here that surprised you or that confirmed suspicions that you had?
If you look right here, you'll see that false fronts have been put in here somewhere along the line. The drawers were damaged, stolen, lost, so they put false fronts in. But the original tracks are still in here for the drawers, with the original stop in the center to stop the drawer from touching each other. It's missing here, but it's still in the center track. So you had 4 drawers that were in the bottom for files and larger items, and this confirms my suspicions that there were indeed drawers in here. And probably, when was it damaged?
Yeah, what happened to it, Dave?
Well, I believe sometime in the 1950s, after they rehabbed the office back to be part of the museum again, somebody broke in and thinking, I believe the drawers were locked or something along those lines. They ended up ripping the drawers apart, and they had to be fixed. And instead of putting the drawers back, they just put, like you said, false fronts back on.
And so this big solid piece of wood here that looks old is actually a modern
This
version?
This I would believe,
is original.
this I believe would be original.
Show them on this side. So this, where these are.
Here's what you've replaced for the drawer front. Here's your original drawer front, and then if you look here, you'll notice that they've glued up 4 pieces, 3 pieces here. Thomas Hope would have never put that many pieces together when he had the availability of large wide planks. He would have never glued up planks. First off, it was time consuming. Second off, it wouldn't look as good.
And he is the most famous furniture maker of the period in this region.
In this region, he is probably the most famous.
Yeah, of that time period, he was one of the first trained cabinet makers and also one of the first trained architects. Our good friends over at the Ramsey House, he's the architect that built Ramsey House.
And did the carvings.
Yes.
He did some beautiful carving work.
And so what kind of work do you have to do to restore this, and how long will it take?
Well, to properly do this, the first fun thing is to search for the next several months or a couple of years to find a plank wide enough that's old. Then it will go back to shop. I will cut a square out here and then start taking it apart because I have no idea how they put it in place. So to not damage the surrounding frame, I will cut away and go from the center out. Once I do that, I will copy the dovetails from this drawer into the new drawers and then color and add what needs to be done to make it look like the proper drawer when it's pulled open, that it's always been there.
So you're the only artisan I know who doesn't want people to realize that anything has been done when you're finished. You want to restore it to what it was before.
I want to get in and get out and nobody knows I was ever there. That's what I want to do.
And from the museum standpoint, everything will be documented before, during, and after to show people down the line what it looked like before, how we did the process, and how it looks afterwards to restore the piece back to what it originally was.
It's also documented in my shop because when I do it for individuals, I don't want 5 years from now for somebody to come and say, I bought this and it's all original, and I have all the paperwork, and I go, well, it might be all original, but I built
X, Y,
this,
Z.
this, and this. I always want to have the documentation
Right.
because I asked the person not to spread false rumors, if you will.
Right. And you're going to be here with your wife, and tell me her name.
My wife Pamela.
Pamela, who doesn't like to be on camera, but the two of you will be here for a few days,
Yep, we'll be here
going
for a
over
few
everything
days.
with a fine-tooth comb and
Right.
helping us to.
Clean all the collection and properly removing the dirt and putting a good clean coat of paste wax. Identifying the damage, making a list of things that I think they need to do, and when I turn the list in, it will be in order of what I think should be done first. They will do what they want done, but I will put in order what I think is the most important pieces to be done first, both from a damage standpoint and from a historical standpoint.
And Dave, last question now before we let folks go. Why do you think it is important and good for our visitors to see this process happening?
Well, for one thing, I think it's important for people to understand that, museums are not static things. I think that people need to see that you don't just fill up a historic house museum with furniture and expect it to basically just stay the same for 100 years. So we've been a museum for, in 2026, it'll be 100 years. And so a lot of the pieces that we've collected have been in the house for that long. And I'm not sure when the last time somebody like Mr. Hooper was here to really care for it. And so if we expect a long time,
Long time.
expect for these items to remain, as an integral part of our collection and be well cared for, we need this kind of work to be done on a regular basis to make sure that something doesn't fall apart, and basically that we can care for these things for generations.
That's it for our special presentation today, but you'll have many more opportunities to celebrate the 225th anniversary of Tennessee statehood as we approach the big day on June 1st, 2021. Blount Mansion is partnering with Visit Knoxville, the City of Knoxville, and our sister museums and the Historic House Museums of Knoxville to bring you a whole series of events leading up to that big day. This video was the first installment in that series of events. Up next is a virtual lecture at 6:30 p.m. on Tuesday evening, February 23rd, hosted by Mabry Hazen House, focusing on the Constitutional Convention of 1870. You can register online at www.mabryhazen.com/statehood series. The grand finale of our 225th anniversary statehood celebrations will take place here in downtown Knoxville on Tuesday morning, June 1st. Join Knoxville Mayor India Kincannon and students from South Knoxville Elementary School as we march from James White's Fort, where Knoxville began, to Blount Mansion, where Tennessee was born. Our short parade will be followed by remarks from the mayor and other leaders, and you will have an opportunity to use a quill pen to sign your name to parchment atop the same desk used for the signing of our state's first Constitution in 1796. We'll enjoy refreshments and wish Tennessee a happy 225th birthday. More events are still being planned and details are still being worked out, but you can stay on top of all of it at this special website, www.tnstatehood.com. Again, that's tnstatehood.com. Check in there regularly for updates and the latest information. I'm Michael Jordan. Thank you for joining us for The Birth of Tennessee, brought to you from Blount Mansion National Historic Landmark in beautiful downtown Knoxville, Tennessee. We'll see you on June 1st as we celebrate 225 years of Tennessee statehood.
This program has been a presentation of Blount Mansion National Historic Landmark in downtown Knoxville, Tennessee. For more information on Blount Mansion National Historic Landmark, including a virtual tour, videos, educational resources, upcoming events, and more, visit www.blountmansion.org. Once again, that's www.blountmansion.org.